Welcome to this evening's De Morgan Foundation talk on the Slade School of Art. It's my honour to welcome Charlotte de Mille to give the presentation this afternoon. Charlotte is an associate lecturer at the Courtauld Institute and curates the Courtauld Gallery's music programme. With them, she co-authored the Animating Art History, a joint initiative with Central St Martin's and the University of Creative Arts, which was long listed for a Clore Award in museum learning. She was visiting scholar at Lingnan University in Hong Kong in 2018 and mid-career fellow at the Paul Mellon Centre for British Art in 2020. And her publications are available online, and I'll pop a link to that in the chat box. We're really looking forward to welcoming Charlotte today to give this lecture and to learn more about Evelyn De Morgan's very early work and about the Slade School of Art more generally. Thank you so much, Charlotte. It's over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And as I was just saying to Sarah, actually, I feel this has been a bit of a lockdown project for me. It began just before the first lockdown, and it seems to have stayed with me during the intervening 18 months. So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to share some of this work and really to talk through the relation of Evelyn De Morgan to the work that I'm going to present today with you, because I feel like I'm coming at it from very much a 19th century female perspective, but not necessarily one that's specifically engaged with Evelyn De Morgan. So I'm really keen to learn from all of you as well. I was going to share my screen and we'll get going. So here we are. So I'm going to begin with a quotation from an artist actually immediately prior to the foundation of the Slade, Anna Mary Howitt, and this is a letter she wrote to her fellow artist Barbara Bodikon in 1848, and it relates a visit that she undertook to the Royal Academy of Arts. She said, "Did I tell you, I went one night to hear Leslie lecture at the Royal Academy. Oh, how terribly did I long to be a man so that I could paint there. When I saw in the first room all the students' easels standing about, lots of canvases and easels against the walls, and here and there a grand old master standing around, a perfect atmosphere of inspiration. And then I passed on to the second room hung around with the academicians' inaugural pictures. One seemed to be stepping into a freer, larger, more earnest artistic world. A world, alas, which one's womanhood debars one from joining. Oh, I felt quite sick at heart. All one's attempts and struggles seemed so pitiful and vain. I felt quite angry at being a woman. It seemed to me to be such a mistake." So, Anna Mary Howitt, and here she is. Her letter really reminds us of the very different context that faced would-be women artists from the middle to the end of the 19th century. And as Philip Hamerton wrote in his Thoughts About Art in 1862, he said, "A feeble dilettantism in drawing seems to be considered essential to every young lady. But as society recalls that ladies should draw badly, so she carefully made it impossible that they should ever have a chance of drawing well." And he goes on to say that serious art for women serious art as an endeavour is unfeminine. So in attempting to reconstruct the experience of women in the Slade, which was founded a decade later in 1871, and in spite of its revolutionary attitude to women artists, evidence of these women's work and lives is relatively sparse. And of course, there have been wonderful discipline-changing studies by Linda Nochlin, such as Why Are There No Women Artists, and pioneering research also by Deborah Cherry and Lisa Tickner. So some of this history has been charted. But on a discovery that the sister of my primary subject of research, Henri Bergson, studied at the Slade from a prodigy age of 15, I set out to uncover something of her life and her experience. And so, for all of Cherry's outstanding work on Anna Mary Howitt, Emily Ford, who is here with her work, or Kate Greenaway will come to in a moment, Emily Ford or Jessie McGregor, Bergson's sister, Mina Bergson, and her fellow student flatmate Beatrice Offor and her best friend Annie Horniman don't really feature very prominently, if at all, in art historical literature. And as the contemporary, or their Slade teacher said, Henry Tonks ruefully commented of his female students, after their 20s, the good work seems to stop. Possibly their powers have not really diminished, but marriage, children, or some such interest has intervened. And once they stop painting, or working in the more available and appropriate media such as book illustration, and it's with this in mind I have this slide here of Kate Greenaway and one of her wonderful illustrations. The trail seems to run cold. But in its first year, summer 1872, women took the only 2 prizes at the Slade, and they soon accounted for 2/3 of the number of students. So I was asking myself why we have such a disproportionate number of female students and prize winners, and then so many blanks in the history around 1900 with that first generation. What happens to them when they're in their 40s and 50s? So besides the pioneer Evelyn De Morgan from these early years, and the star Gwen John from the late 1890s, who was a direct contemporary of William Orpen, what do we know of the many, many female artists, students, and their experience? Well, certainly, as Anna Howitt's letter makes absolutely plain, access to art school was frustrating at best. And the first women to attend the RA in 1860, Anna Laura Hereford, did so by applying with her initials only, duping the jury, who then embarrassingly found that there was no law under which she could be prevented from attending. 12 other women followed in the next year, but due to cramped teaching conditions, women were then banned again. So there was this period at the Royal Academy where they were allowed in and then they were banned and then they were allowed back in again. And this was also accompanied with various discussions in the press. So in 1885, the treasurer of the Royal Academy, J.C. Horsley, wrote to the Times anonymously under the title of A British Matron, rejecting life drawing for women. And he said, life study was unwomanly and violated Christian principles. And as a speech before the Church Congress in October 1885, he continued his theme. He said, where is the justification in God's sight for those who induce women so to ignore their natural modesty and quench their sense of true shame as to expose their nakedness before men and thus destroy all that is pure and lovely in their womanhood? So this is a very obviously reactive and conservative viewpoint from the Royal Academy, and you can only begin to imagine what it would be like to study there with somebody like that as your treasurer. But in spite of this, Louisa Starr won the Academy Gold Medal in 1867, and Jessie McGregor, whose 2 paintings, In the Reign of Terror on the left and Waiting on the right, were both sort of star pupils at the Royal Academy. And McGregor remembered the upheaval that her success caused. And she writes, I had none of the advantages of figure study now freely open to students of both sexes, so that I was under great disabilities compared to my fellow competitors. Perhaps it was this that made the men students so enraged as they were at the success of this chit of a girl, as I was called. Feeling was so high that night that in their wrath the students smashed a cast. And so to be a recipient of a prize as a woman also had its perils. And I think this tells us a lot about the characters of the pioneering women who went to these art schools during this period in the 1860s, 70s and 80s. So the private alternatives, if you weren't one of those lucky few who managed to get temporarily accepted into the Royal Academy, or one of those who went to the Slade on its foundation in 1870, the private alternatives were the Female School of Art from 1859, the Henry Sass School, Art School, and Henrietta Ward School, and Hatherley's, and none of these permitted life drawing from a nude figure. And even once the difficulty of attaining the training was overcome. Exhibiting and receiving objective criticism was a very major hurdle. So Ruskin's advice to a lady in the 1850s ran as follows. He said, "You must resolve to be quite a great paintress. The feminine termination does not exist, there never having been such a being yet as a lady who could paint. Try and be the first." Similarly, the Illustrated London News's estimation of an exhibition by the Society of Women Artists didn't expect much. And again, I'm going to quote from the Illustrated London News, which said, "Strength of will and power of creation belonging rather to the other sex. We do not, of course, look for the more daring in an exhibition of female artists." And by 1870, the same paper praised Emily Mary Osborne's painting Lost, which is here from 1880. And I also am showing here Nameless and Friendless from 1857 in the Tate. She was described, or Lost was described, as creditable to its author, both as a woman and as a painter. And the Art Journal suggested that it was worthy, we will not say, of being a female artist, now a term of contempt. It holds its place strongly by its genuine pictorial merits. So this kind of backhanded criticism was just absolutely everywhere. So even at best, it's pretty terrible praise that's being offered. And just a note on Nameless and Friendless here, I think it's a very poignant image relating a sort of narrative of a woman trying to sell her work to an art dealer, and this very male-dominated world in which she's having to step, and of course to do business, which again was deemed to be unfeminine. So at the first exhibition of the soon-to-be very highly prestigious Grosvenor Gallery in 1877, there were 9 female artists out of a total of 64. And of course, this included, as you will probably know, given my audience this evening, the 1874 Slade Prize winner, Evelyn Pickering De Morgan. And she was showing this work, Ariadne in Naxos, which is in the Foundation's collection. The Grosvenor Gallery continued to show women artists, but again in relatively small numbers. So in 1878 there were 11 women out of 96, and in 1879 22 out of 113. And so the Magazine of Art for the Grosvenor's 1886 show again noted a work of Evelyn Pickering De Morgan's work on display, but it said Evelyn Pickering's only contribution is hung very near the ceiling. And it continued that works by Dorothy Tennant and Louise Joplin were conspicuously on the line, so on the sight line, rather than being hung very high up. And this was an article really about the politics of the Grosvenor Gallery, which the magazine went on to explain the politics was just as bad at the Grosvenor Gallery, but the pictures were rather better than those at the Royal Academy. So here we go. Let's get the right mouse for the right computer. So in this context that I've been outlining to you in the past few minutes, the opening of a government art school that was open to women was absolutely life-changing. And in the contemporary artist reviewer Charlotte Weeks's words, here, for the first time in England, indeed in Europe, a public fine art school was thrown open to male and female students on precisely the same terms, and giving both sexes equal opportunities. Now, of course, this wasn't quite the case. And in his inaugural lecture, the head of the school, the Slade, Edward Poynter, claimed that he said, "It's my desire that in all classes, except of course those of the study of the nude model, the male and female students should work together." And this issue about drawing from the nude model was one that sort of bugged the experience of women through art school really up until well into the early 20th century. And despite Poynter's aim for women and men to study together, the UCL calendar for 1871 to 72 was also very keen to reassure prospective students and parents that it said, the buildings in their approaches have been carefully designed in such a way as to make due provision for the admission of ladies as students of the Fine Arts School. The structural arrangements will render it easy to keep the ladies' classes quite distinct from the others, if it should be thought desirable to maintain such separation. So again, there were different entrances, there were different common rooms. So there were ways of keeping the two very, very much apart. And the AGM report for 1872 decided, after, it has to be said, after some discussion, to permit women to compete for scholarships. And as a result of which, a great many women did receive scholarships, which was a slight embarrassment to their male students. So between 1872 and 1875, the numbers of scholarships to women and men were equal. There were 4 each. In 1883 to 1884, 9 female students were awarded prizes for modelling, but only 2 male students were awarded prizes for modelling. And overall, there were 5 scholarships and 22 prizes taken by women in that first 12 years from 1871 to 1883. But even so, life drawing was from the draped model. And this is an illustration of what that might look like, but one that was taken from a class actually at the Norwich School of Art. So working from the draped model continued until 1893. And the Slade staff was entirely male until 1928. Given that, what was it like to actually study there from a woman's perspective? Well, it was with this in mind that I had this lady on the screen, Mabel Collins, otherwise known as Kenningale Cook. And she wrote on the teaching at the Slade for the Woman magazine in 1872. She said, the mixed class is much the largest at present, numbering from 30 to 40. It is a very hard-working and studious class, and it shows at last that it is quite possible for young men and women to work together from an almost nude model in perfect quiet and propriety. Male and female students will never find any difficulty in working together, because their aim is too high and their art too sacred for them to think of false proprieties. The responsibility, of course, lies principally with the ladies. If they work in earnest, looking neither to the right or to the left, they will never meet with annoyance and will gradually form around them a pure, straightforward atmosphere. It's an extraordinary statement. She was obviously a very forceful lady. As you might know, she had another career as a novelist, and I'm putting it's one of the covers to one of her novels that's on the screen there beside her portrait. Having said that, the teachers, and Edward Poynter in particular, was particularly keen to demonstrate that actually Mabel Collins was right, that for the most part there was no problem. And so in his 1872 annual report, he noted that there was not the slightest inconvenience has arisen from having classes composed of ladies and gentlemen. And the officers of the college are not aware that objections have ever been made by any of the students on this combined instruction. Interestingly, in 1874, the omission of the ladies-only class in the morning resulted, he said, in a more serious set of students attending more regularly. And unsurprisingly, he also observed that the students on the full-time general course were far more serious than those on other courses, whatever their gender. And so, again, it's interesting to look at the figures. Women in the Slade as a whole, there were 61 women to 44 men, but on the general course, the numbers were reversed. There were 25 men and 12 women. So the women were outnumbered on the general course, but were the majority of students in terms of the evening courses and part-time courses. So to the governing board and the general public, Poynter was outspoken in his progressive attitudes. More privately, though, he noted that, he said, some students have very mistaken ideas and think that a master should be always standing over them or be always in the school. Such complaints are generally from young ladies. I think that what's telling here is just how hungry for tuition these women were, how much they recognised their precarious nature of their attention, of their attendance. Mabel Cook's comment, it was up to the ladies to make this work. But they were also more critical of the quality of teaching. And though I would also say, and as Henry Tonks recalled, more pliable. Tonks said that women were far better pupils than men because they will do what they are told, where men are inclined to doubt their teacher. So again, there were lots of conflicts that were being addressed during this period as to how to negotiate equality of education. So the reminiscence of Mabel Collins or Mabel Canningdale Cook and Charlotte Weeks's article for the Magazine of Art from June 1883 give us an insight into the years of Beatrice Offor, Mina Bergson and Annie Horniman, the three women who were my reason for starting this research, as I say, 2 years ago. The Slade had an intelligent system of instruction, Charlotte Weeks wrote. She said, Mr. Pointer goes from easel to easel, sometimes pausing to complete a study. Whereas, she said, Alphonse Legros, who arrived on the staff as 1876 during Evelyn Pickering's time, would provide painting demonstrations, completing a head in 1 hour and 30 minutes. But Charlotte Weeks said that, that his teaching method was exceptional, that with a brush, she wrote, containing a little thin transparent colour, the leading lines and contours are touched in. With the same simple material, the broad masses of shadow are put in, then gradually the flesh tones are added, the half tones and the lights laid on, the highest lights being reserved for the last, consummate details. In about an hour and a half, sometimes in less time, the study is completed, and the watchers probably learnt more in that silent lesson than during 3 times the amount of verbal instruction. Ever ready to recognise talent and encourage industrious, honest work, even where no great talent exists, Professor Legros wages incessant war against all attempts at pseudo-mastery in his students' work. Classes at the Slade and in Pointer's inaugural lecture, he makes this very clear, comprised of consistent study from the life model, and I've touched on this already, the cast room and the life model, and how much access women had to studying from life. So the Slade was following the Académie des Beaux-Arts in wanting to prioritise life drawing. And in 1872, its calendar instructed that the study from the living model is of absolutely paramount importance. So there were nude living models which sat for 3 hours every day from 10 till 1, and a draped model in a separate studio for the women. And so this is what you've got here, the draped model in a separate studio. And then the male and female students could work together in the antique school, and we've got the antique school. This is, as I say, Norwich School of Art, but same idea, cast rooms and casts of antiquities. And so the antique school was open on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays at the Slade. But the draped model sat there for women only, in order to suit those ladies who might not wish to work in a mixed class. And then in addition to this, there were drawing and modelling classes in the evening, but only some of these were open to women. And this again is a slightly grey area as to what classes were open to women and what weren't, because there were additional classes for anatomy, for instance, and I haven't been able to work out whether they were open to women or not. So whilst in 1873 to 4, so the time of Evelyn Pickering's time as a student, students had to demonstrate facility in drawing from the antique before being admitted to the life room. It's clear from the size of prizes on offer that the life room was the more important part of the training. So for life drawing, a prize was £10, whereas from a drawing from the antique, it was £3. So Poynter, though, also encouraged studying the techniques from the old master prints and drawings of the British Museum and the National Gallery, as well as UCL's own collection. And he established the Fine Art Library with huge photographs of Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, and other photographs that we know were sort of all over the walls of the Slade originally. And these were supposed to offer inspiration, but also things that could be copied. And then, as I said, there are these extra lectures on anatomy, on bones, joints, muscles, on perspective by a professor of maths. There are lectures on classical archaeology, and in the calendar it makes particular notice that the ladies were allowed to classical archaeology, and for that reason I wonder whether they were allowed at any of those other classes already listed. And then between 1880 and 90 there was a chemistry of materials class, and there was art history was offered between 1890 and 91. But in terms of what happened in these life classes, the Slade was also slightly unusual, even with the study of the draped nudes. And William Rothenstein recalled, and although this is 20 years after Evelyn Pickering left, the point still holds. But in the 1890s, William Rothenstein recalled that we drew on encre paper with red or black Italian chalk, an unsympathetic and rather greasy material. The use of bread or India rubber was disencouraged, at a time when everywhere else in England students were rubbing and tickling their paper with stump chalk, charcoal and India rubber. In the afternoon class, models move position every 30 minutes, and as a result, you get these rapid linear sketches, and I've got two on the screen here. On the right, you've got study by Ida Nettleship, Ida John. So you get these rapid linear sketches in contrast to the delicate and lengthy techniques advocated elsewhere. And so Sidney Colvin, who was director at the British Museum at this point, considered the teaching at the Slade contrasted very favourably with those at the most sort of severe art schools. The Slade was very much a rigorous training. So instead, in Hilary Taylor's words, the Slade promoted individual facility and style against academic convention, and it recognised the need for new kinds of exhibiting bodies and a vigorous, if not quite uninhibited, approach to subject matter and execution. It was adventurous, clamorous, stimulating, and it was clearly going to be a certain character that would be attracted to it and most certainly changed by it. So even the art schools in Paris maintained segregation of the sexes in their studios, and they expected the women only to sign up for half a day's tuition. So of the women I've shown you so far, Emily Ford, who was at the Slade in 1875, and Mabel Cook became prominent in women's rights. Ford also joined the Society for Psychical Research, and Anna Howitt became a noted medium working with Madame Blavatsky. And so it was one of her spirit drawings I had on the screen beside her photograph. Ida Nettleship, whose figure study is on the right, famously married Augustus John, agreed to a ménage à trois with John's mistress Dorelia, and then escaped with her to Paris, leaving John behind to look after their children. So in each case, these women found independent and daring roles for themselves. So how do my three main protagonists, fit into this history? On the left, you've got Annie Horniman, who studied at the Slade, or graduated from the Slade in 1882. She was the granddaughter of the founder of the Horniman Museum, and she was the founder and financial supporter of the Abbey Theatre in Dublin and the Gaiety Theatre in Manchester. In the centre, here, you've got Beatrice Offor in her studio in Chelsea in 1902. She's the only one who remained a painting artist in a traditional sense. And then on the right here, we've got Mina Bergson, recipient of a scholarship in 1883 and 4 merit certificates for her drawing at the Slade between 1880 and 1886. And Beatrice and Mina, so these two, shared a flat at 17 Fitzroy Street during the year of 1886. And so not only did Mina go to the Slade aged 15 in 1880, but then she moves into independent accommodation with Beatrice in 1886. And I think this, again, is something that is really quite startling for the time. So of these women, Beatrice is the easiest to trace historically through art journals. She's mentioned in the Year's Art of 1885, and both Punch and Womanhood refer to works that she showed at the RA in 1904, and they included this work on the right here of her brother-in-law, Sir Ralph Littler. She was featured in the ladies' column of The Star in 1907, where she was famed for the creator of the famous offer heads known the world over. And this is an example of what's known as an offer head. But all 3 women took very unconventional paths. So Beatrice defied her Baptist family in her marriage, and worse, she was already pregnant when that marriage occurred. Annie Horniman never married. She fell out with her family over her father's second marriage and her use of her inheritance for the theatre. And Mina's marriage to the founder of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Samuel MacGregor Mathers, appears to have separated her from her immediate family in London, though very likely not from her brother Henri in Paris. Through Mina, Annie Horniman also joined the Golden Dawn and became a very prominent member. And whilst Beatrice did not join the Golden Dawn, her husband, William Littler, appears to have had connections certainly to spiritualist circles, because the record for his death tragically in Banstead Asylum in 1899 reports that the occult and hypnotism was involved in his death. And meanwhile, Beatrice's paintings have very esoteric themes. I'd like to spend a little bit of time looking at some of these. So Beatrice is said to have used a lot of her sisters as models. On the right here, you've got her work, The Crystal Gazer. And I'm comparing it with the photograph of Mina, because although Beatrice often did use her sisters, I think in this particular case this might be a portrait of Mina Bergson instead. I should say that none of the paintings I'm about to show you are dated, and I'll come back to thoughts about that in a moment. So here we have Circe on the right, Circe of course being the goddess of magic or an enchantress, and a melody on the left, and this lady is wearing a wreath quite similar to the wreath in The Crystal Gazer. So all these 3 pictures are sort of grouped by the wreaths in the hair, the loose gowns, the robes, and they seem to be accompanied by sort of smoky, shadowy figures of inspiration. The lady in a melody seems to be holding a psaltery, which is a form of Celtic harp, which was being made by Arnold Dolmetsch and was advocated by another member of the Golden Dawn and friend of Mina and Annie's, Florence Farr. So if this is a psaltery, perhaps this is another indication of, or some evidence that Beatrice Offor continued to know what Mina and her associates were up to even after her marriage. And the Dolmetschers visited Mina and Mathers' home, Stent Lodge, out near the Horniman. So Destiny here on the left is actually dated. It's one of the only ones that is. This is dated 1894, and it shows a woman with a piercing gaze that meets us from beneath this veil. She holds a spool of wool wound like the traditional swaddling of a baby, and behind we see the shadowy procession of people led by this man here with a scepter or wand, and in these dark russet gown. I'm going to show you, I think, yeah, we have here. So very, very difficult to see. I'm sorry, it's quite pixelated, but he's got this scepter here. He seems to be wearing some sort of dark rusty red robe. And I'm comparing that. This is a painting, the only surviving oil painting we have, of Samuel McGregor Mathers by Mina Bergson. Again, showing these sort of deep russet red robes. And again, here's Samuel McGregor Mathers in Egyptian costume, which I'll come back to. So I'm suggesting that this profile is perhaps not so dissimilar to Samuel McGregor Mathers here. And if that's the case, then maybe we've got something like that going on in the back of Destiny. I'm just showing you here a study for Destiny, which accompanies it. In Beatrice Offor's The Love Potion, which is on the screen now, we have another loose-robed young woman wearing a serpent eternity bracelet, which also appears in The Crystal Gazer. And she's holding a smoking bowl in which some liquid from a small copper jug has been poured. And she's got this roll of parchment, which is tucked in beside her down here. I probably don't need to remind you of this picture in the De Morgan Foundation. This is Evelyn De Morgan's The Love Potion from 1903, with its shelf here of Renaissance occult books that represent a path to spiritual enlightenment. I'll come back to that in a moment. So there's this wall or sort of circle of ether here behind this lady in Beatrice's work, and it obscures a very shadowy frieze beneath the wainscoting, and the lady's arm, so the frieze is here, the lady's arm is resting on this leopard skin. And leopard skins were particularly significant to the Egyptian rituals that Mina and her husband practiced in the theatre in Paris during the 1890s. So here is Mina Bergson and Samuel McGregor Mathers here with his leopard skin on his shoulder, dressed as the high priest and priestess, high priest Ramesses and high priestess Inari, for their theatre piece at the Théâtre de Bodnier in Paris in 1896. And Mina, in an interview about this theatre piece, said that the spots of the leopard skin symbolise stars in the world atmosphere, what the theosophists call the astral body. And so if we look at the frieze here behind the lady in the Love Potion, again, I'm really sorry about the pixelation and the sort of darkness. This is partly due to the darkness in this painting, but there seems to be here the head of a dog, which I'm wondering if this is the head of Anubis, the Egyptian god of the underworld, or his brother Weparet, whose name translates as the opening of the ways. Again, it would be easier to see this in real life than it is in the slide, but here is the outline I'm suggesting of this head. So before we leave these paintings, I'd like to make a few tentative comments on their colour. And as you'll know if you've seen this picture or seen its entry on the De Morgan Foundation website, you'll know that the colours that Evelyn Pickering De Morgan uses in this picture adhere to the alchemical colour symbolism that was promoted by Paracelsus. And it also sheds light, perhaps, on her intent. So in Paracelsus's colour symbolism, the colours mark a progressive stage to spiritual enlightenment, from black, which is defined as the material state of guilt, sin and death, white, the early stages of purification, red, and then yellow towards the gold of salvation. And it's interesting to consider that colour symbolism in relation to the Golden Dawn, because it also had colour symbolism that was itself drawn from these same Renaissance texts. So I'm not for a minute suggesting that Evelyn Pickering had any idea what was going on in the Golden Dawn, but their sources, their Renaissance sources, overlap. So I'm going to show you here, this is Mina's design for a ritual cup, where she's overlaying, this is the colour symbolism which she's mapped out from based on a Kabbalah or tree of life, and she's mapping these points which you can see here onto the design for a cup, which is here its base, indigo stem of a cup, she says. Here, the red glow of heat in the middle of the cup, and then here the chalice or the drinking vessel on the top, where you've got death, and then you've got this sort of crimson and orange at the top. So colour symbolism was vitally important, it seems, to both. As I say, I have absolutely, I'm yet to know, to do more work in sort of pinning this down. I'm not sure that it's possible to pin it down, but it's interesting to just think about the overlap of texts here. So the undated group of paintings at Bruce Castle Museum that I've just been showing you by Beatrice Offor is unlike the far more conventional Offor heads, which were commissioned pieces like the one I showed you a few slides back. And the contrast suggests to me that they were completed from personal interest rather than with a patron in mind. It's hard to know what Beatrice thought of her friend Mina's extraordinary path and how closely they remained in contact after Beatrice's husband's tragic death in 1899. With no certainty of dates for these Bruce Castle paintings, it's hard to know if they represent the time of her close friendship with Mina or whether they suggest a lifelong curiosity in more esoteric subjects. And nor can I be sure if these paintings indicate allegiance to these ideas or ambiguity. And so on the screen here, I've got Girl with a Witch. The warm, rosy light and contented face focused in the far distance tell us one thing, but the threadbare clothes tell a life of material hardship, which indeed we know that Mina endured. And then Destiny, which I've got here again on the right, shows utter conviction, but its sombre colours don't seem to hold great promise. And it's this ambiguous quality that fascinates me in Beatrice's work, as so far as we know, she watched the occult revival of the Golden Dawn as an outsider who had privileged access to its central figures. So what do her paintings of these women say of her response to female experience in circa 1900? Well, I could follow Elise Lawton Smith's estimation of Evelyn Pickering's love potion in suggesting that she used her spiritualist vocabulary to subvert and renegotiate traditional roles and stereotypes of women, providing instead a strong, powerful, skilled, intelligent protagonist capable of reaching the enlightenment she herself sought. This is on the De Morgan website's page relating to the love potion. I'm really grateful to Sarah for pointing me in that direction. But I think something of this intention that Elise Lawton Smith is talking about is perhaps also relevant to the work of Beatrice. I think Beatrice would have been very aware that the Golden Dawn, like the Slade, offered equality for women at a time when this was scarce elsewhere. So prior to its foundation, Samuel MacGregor Mathers was unusual in his support for Dr. Anna Kingsford's campaign for women's rights, and Mina took the Celticized name Moina on her marriage, became High Priestess of the Order, the first initiate into the higher Second Order, and a noted clairvoyant whose visions were essential to the writing of the Golden Dawn Order's texts, the flying rolls, as well as informing the interior decoration of their temples, their rituals and their objects. And again, I can just show you a couple of these. This is, again, another design based on the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, which then is here being mapped into the vault for one of the temples, where you've got this chalice in the middle, and then it shows you some of the different places that people would stand and objects that were placed around in the vault. And here, this is actually a door of the vault. This is from George Poloxven's notebooks, which are in the archive in Dublin. Poloxven was Yeats's uncle, and again, very involved in the Golden Dawn. So the Golden Dawn's first temple in London in 1888, the Isis Urania temple, took its name from two goddesses, Isis, the goddess of life, motherhood and magic, and Urania, the goddess of universal love, the muse of astronomy. The inspiration and direction for the order was powerfully female, reinforced first by Annie and then the actress Florence Farr taking the lead of the Temple in London when Samuel and Mina moved to Paris in 1891. So we've come a long way from the Slade years with which I began, but I'm going to close with some observations regarding the congruence rather than the dissimilarity between these different institutions, if you will. Art school of any kind clearly attracted independent, active young women who fought for their education and equality in society. Many of these women forged notable careers pushing the boundaries of women's rights. And the Golden Dawn, like the Slade, was a space of equality of gender, where talent rather than gender dictated prizes or promotion through the order's ranks. Participants shared a conviction in the processual development of selfhood and a desire to use it for social good. And in both the Slade and the Golden Dawn, images and their production were obviously the foundation of teaching for the Slade, but images were utterly vital to the visualization of these insights in the Golden Dawn. So could Mina and Annie Horniman have found their way to the Golden Dawn without the Slade? The answer is probably, although their roles would have been very different because they would not have had an art school training, nor would they have had the experience of fighting their corner in a very male-dominated world. But could the Golden Dawn have been so influential without the artists to realise its abstract thought visually? Well, I think this is probably much more unlikely. Thank you. So I'm just going to close my PowerPoint down, stop sharing my screen. Maybe come back to Sarah if there are any questions. I'm very happy to open up.
Oh, yes, I have unmuted myself. There we go. Thank you so much, Charlotte. What an incredibly fascinating talk to reveal the lives of some, amazing artists who you just think to yourself, if they had been male, would we have heard about them already? Because they had these amazing careers, beautiful pictures, and the sort of interesting biographies as well to go with it. So brilliant talk. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today. And it's fabulous to see who some of Evelyn De Morgan's, not quite contemporaries, they came a little bit later, but it really gives a flavour for what she was up to. And the comparisons between the paintings of her and Offor are absolutely there as well, which is a lot of food for thought. Does anybody have any questions? We'll use the chat function to take them, and if you want to put them in there, I think Charlotte can see the chat box as well, or
yeah, I can.
put them to her. So do type any comments up in the chat box just to make sure that everybody can hear what's going on clearly. We tend not to turn microphones off, so if you want to use that function, then you're very welcome to. Nothing coming through at the moment. Which perhaps leaves me to make more of a comment than a question, Charlotte, but it's not in the De Morgan Foundation collection, but I do know of a private collector that has a sketchbook of Evelyn De Morgan's anatomical drawings from the class that she took in 1873 while she was at the Slade. So we're pretty convinced that she took that anatomy class, and I'll make sure that I send those images to you and put you in touch.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah,
Just say it now whilst I remember.
Yeah, exactly. Because I that's a sort of detail which, unless you've got, one of those notebooks to hand, you just simply wouldn't. It's hard to tell from the way that the school advertised it. So, yeah, I'd love to see that and be put in touch. Thank you. We have now got some questions in the chat. So, is this research published? Not yet, but thank you for asking. The work on Mina, Bergson and the Golden Dawn in particular is a chapter in my book, which, all being well, will be out either December or January. So it's away with the publisher at the moment. But that so there's a lot in that chapter which also covers the early years of the Slade, although in a slightly different way. So its focus is very much more on Mina Bergson and less on the others around her. But that's where it's going to be first off. So soon. but not quite yet. Did it cost to attend? Yes, it did, and I've actually got the exact figures. If I just go back to that, I wasn't going to read out a lot of figures because they can be quite hard to digest if I gave too many. But basically, it was £7, I think, in 1870. Let me just find it. And then the extra classes also had extra prices attached to them. So a term's fee for the general course was £7 and 7 shillings, and a partial course was £5 and 5 shillings. An evening class for drawing and modelling was £2 and 12 shillings and sixpence. But for those evening classes, female students were only admitted to the antique school. So, again, you know, what you were buying was slightly different depending on whether you were a man or a woman, but the prices were the same, and I think that's important to note. Yep. Let me just pick up on the next question. Artist at the Birmingham School of Art. Okay, so Louise, thank you. Their trajectory through the Slade system. So in the very early years of the Slade, you had to prove yourself in the antique room, so therefore drawing from antique models and casts rather than from life, in order to progress to the life room. So for the first year, you might end up only in the antique room, in the cast room, and then only then did you qualify to go into the life room, at which point, if you were a woman, you were going into a life room with a draped model. During the sort of that first 30 years of the Slade, I think there was a lot of pressure from students to be allowed into the life room sooner. And so it did change, although the exact date at which that changed, I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head. So yeah, really fascinating. And I'm afraid I don't know a lot about the trajectory through the Birmingham School of Art, so I'd be really interested to know a bit more about that from you as well. Lauren, did no one in Victorian England know or value female artists? For example, Renaissance artists. Yeah, great question. From the examples, the quotations that I've given you, it would suggest that they didn't. I think, of course, they did, but they weren't either. So somebody like Artemisia wasn't perhaps as well known as she should have been. She was under the shadow of her father, or she was understood to be this radical exception that was a genius, and so therefore so atypical that it wasn't worth mentioning, if that makes sense. You know, there wasn't, you know, the sort of idea of an everyday woman artist as being something that was common rather than something that was really sort of once in every 200 years. Was I think one that was a bit harder to swallow. I also think that there is a great deal of sort of the patriarchy wanting to keep women maybe out of the limelight in that way. So it served them well to say that women couldn't draw and couldn't paint and shouldn't be this, that, and the other. Though maybe that's my bias coming in. I'm happy to take some responses to that. But yeah, I think that where they did know about them, you know, they were treated very much as exceptional circumstances rather than something that was common practice. Louise, do you know if students undertook costume studies? Yeah, so did they forget about Angelica Kaufman? Do you know what? I haven't found anything really much about Angelica Kaufman in the comments. Goodness knows why. I think maybe it was convenient to forget about her because she's so brilliant. I would love to find more about her, but I think they chose not to reference her. I mean, this is clearly an area where we all need to do some more work and work out, you know, who was saying what about these remarkable women artists. Louise, going back to costume studies, I haven't come across a lot of costume studies as a term at the Slade in this period. I'm not saying that that's not there. I know that they certainly, so towards the turn of the century, of course, there were a lot of sort of trompe l'oeil, you know, standing statue. What's the word? You know, where you would take you would make the poses of a particular painting for fun. So, for instance, you might want to sit and take on the role of Ariadne in Evelyn Pickering's Ariadne, or you might try and reenact Titian's Diana and Actaeon or something like that. There was a lot of that kind of thing going on. But that was much more at an informal level, rather, I think, than at art school. And then I think, you know, art school, sort of informally through art school, there are various trainings or various moments where students would get together and they would make these kind of fixed poses based on paintings from earlier times, and obviously that all included dressing up in the appropriate things. But that's obviously separate to doing so in order to draw from it, which is, I think, what you're suggesting. Yeah, tableau vivant, that's exactly the word I was looking for. Thank you, yes. Great. I think we might be through with questions for a minute. I'm happy to hang around for a bit if you...
Any inspirations
have anything else, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I think it was just such a comprehensive presentation, really, Charlotte. Thank you so much for doing that for us this evening. I enjoyed it immensely. Like I said, you know, to see those images and hear the stories of those women and the interesting lives that they had, and have that really brought to life. And yeah, I mean, it's just absolutely what needs to be done, isn't it, to redress that balance. And so thank you so much for your work and your research in that area. Thank
you for great questions as well, everybody. And it's really, you know, it's work in progress for all of us. So yeah, please keep working on it, and feel free to message me anytime if you've got other things that come to you later.
Super. Well, we'll let everybody get off and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks again, Charlotte. Thank you to everybody for coming along and bringing your fantastic questions with you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.